everyone, and thank you for attending our third Wednesday program. My name is Miranda. I'm the educator here at Rome Historical Society. We're really happy to have you and that you continue to tune into our programs. If you want to find out about our future programs or watch any of our past programs, you can go over to our Facebook page, facebook.com/RomeHistorical, or head over to our website, romehistoricalsociety.org. Those two places will have all of the most up-to-date information about what's going on here at Rome Historical Society. Today, we're joined by Ashley Hopkins-Benton, Senior Historian and Curator of Social History at the New York State Museum. And today, she is here to tell us about Henry DiSpirito. He was a sculptor, artist, and valued community member in Utica. Thank you for being here with us, Ashley.
I'm so glad to join you today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us virtually. Let me just open my slides.
Yeah, so without further ado, we'll hand it over to you, Ashley, and you can go through your presentation.
Wonderful. So I'm so glad that you're all here to learn about the sculptor Henry DiSpirito, who was a long-term resident of Utica, New York. I first got to know Henry DiSpirito, not in person. He passed away, unfortunately, before I started working on his history, but by working on a thesis on him as part of my graduate program at the Cooperstown graduate program. And I got to explore the collections of his sculptures and his papers at the Fenimore Art Museum. DiSpirito's works were inspired by his birthplace, Castleforte, Italy, as well as his adopted hometown of Utica, New York. And his works are important because they reached a national audience, but also a very diverse local audience, and he had a long-lasting impact on his community of Utica, especially among audiences that were often forgotten, including the visually impaired. DiSpirito is best known for his work in the direct carving method of sculpture. This means that he chose a rock or later in his career, a piece of wood, and he would carve away from it to reveal the sculpture that he saw hidden inside. So you can see an example of his work on the left. That's a work called La Primavera, which is limestone embedded in sandstone, which he carved away to reveal the squirrel figure. You can see here there are some other artists who were working in the United States at the same time, also working in the direct carving method. And what I find really interesting is that a number of these artists who were known for this method were also immigrants, just like DiSpirito. Robert Laurent originally came from France. William Zorach was an immigrant from Lithuania. And John Flanagan was also well known for this method of sculpting. It's not known for sure if DiSpirito saw any of their works, but it's important to know that he was working in this tradition at the same time. So Henry DiSpirito was born in 1898 in Castleforte, Italy, and he was originally named Erasmo DiSpirito. His name was changed when he immigrated. His mother was Anna Riccardi. She was a farmer, and his father was Giuseppe DiSpirito. He was a stonemason. DiSpirito left his formal education in the 4th grade to become an apprentice to his father as a stonemason, and he long felt a desire to become an artist, but he had a duty to his family, so he continued his apprenticeship. You can see here on the left his work, The Water Carrier, which was inspired by the women he saw in his village going down to the village fountain to collect water for their cooking and cleaning and household needs. Here's a portrait of DiSpirito as a young man. As I mentioned, he did continue to do art even though he couldn't do it as much as he wanted to because of his apprenticeship. But he was given a major opportunity, a chance to exhibit his paintings at a local hotel by restaurant owner Antonio Coletta. And because of that opportunity, his works were then seen by Carmine Fusco, who was a visiting painter. And Fusco offered him the opportunity to become an apprentice as a painter. So DiSpirito actually left Castleforte and moved to Sessa Arancia with Fusco to serve an apprenticeship. Unfortunately, that time came to an end with the opening of World War I, and he was called into service in the military He was not in a fighting position, but he saw office service, and he was very affected by the pain and suffering he saw in his country. You can see on the left his work, The Pain of War, from the Utica College collection. You can see the anguish on this woman's face, and this was inspired by scenes he saw during the war in his homeland. On the right is after the battle, and this is an image, a sculpture of two bulls who have been fighting, and they are just worn out to the point of not being able to fight anymore. This piece is from 1947. DiSpirito was known for his phrase, "After the battle, no one wins," which really goes along with this sculpture. He also wrote, "Art is for humanity, not just for the few on this earth. If instead of a gun or toy soldiers, every child were given a brush, molding clay, or a sculptor's tool, this would be a happier world, the kind of world it was intended to be." So you can really see this long-reaching impact that seeing war firsthand had on him and his sculptures. He came out of military service in October of 1920, and in his memoirs he recorded, "Returning home, there was little, primarily bread. The populace lived in the most squalid poverty. In northern Italy, there were violent strikes. The workers occupied factories that could not sustain them because of the lack of prime materials. Italy, after the war, lived in a state of violence. Mussolini seemed to be going toward a dictatorship, and it was then that I thought to immigrate." So on March 18th, 1921, he left Italy on the boat Duca to Costa, which you see there, and headed to join his uncle and cousin in Utica, where he arrived on April 1st, 1921. You can see his work, The Refugee, on the left-hand side, and that is also inspired, of course, by his immigration experience and the other people that were traveling with him. Upon his arrival, he was renamed Henry, so that's where he gets the name that we know him by today. And that's something that he didn't tell his daughters until much later in life. They did not know that he had a different name when he was born in Italy. Again, in his memoirs, he records, "We disembarked and boarded a train. Every one of us immigrants had a card attached to us that guided us to our destination. During the trip, when the train would stop, I was curious to look out and see the houses, listen to the talking, a language very different from mine. When I heard the arrival call for Utica, Utica, I cannot describe the emotions I felt at the moment. I thought I was daydreaming. Instead, it was real." So this practice of pinning cards onto immigrants who did not speak English with their destination was very common. Here in the New York State Museum, we have some of those cards in our collection, in our immigrant collections. When DiSpirito arrived in Union Station in Utica, he was joyous at the sight of the Grand Station and the Carrara marble from his homeland. But then he went outside and he was heartbroken at the sight of streets that were dirt, sidewalks that were made of wood, and most of the buildings wood. He said, "They showed me nothing of beauty." And he had a lot of adjustment to do as he arrived here. But soon he would come to feel at home in the Mohawk Valley. And you can see this painting from 1940 showing the scenery here in the Mohawk Valley. DiSpirito went to work studying English at night school, and he continued his education throughout his life. He had a lifelong love of the library and of schools and of learning, so he definitely continued that. He became a citizen in 1930, and he had difficulty finding work initially because of the union system in the United States. It was hard to get into the construction work that he knew so well, even with prior training like he had. He worked in a cotton mill. He worked as a house painter. The house painting caused him medical issues. And eventually he was finally able to get into work as a bricklayer and stonemason, as you can see in the photo on the right. On the left is one of his sculptures called the Toiler's Hand, which shows the very strong presence of a hand of a stonemason worker like himself. He worked on a number of buildings and structures at institutions that he would later show his work in, which is really interesting. He worked on buildings at Hamilton College, Colgate University, and the wall of the parking lot of the Munson-Williams-Proctor Art Institute, which is actually where this carving of a fox is located. That is something that he did as a little add-on as he was working on laying those stones. He later in life applied to the Guggenheim for a fellowship, and in his application, which is very telling of the struggle that he was having at the time of having work as a bricklayer and stonemason, but also wanting to do his art, he wrote, "The fellowship would relieve me of the necessity of working at my trade as a bricklayer and stonemason, and would provide me with a sustained period of direct contact with nature in the form of both subject and material. Since the start of my career as an artist, my work has been done after working hours, on Sundays and holidays. Time has literally been stolen in which to do this work, as I had to fulfill my obligations as a husband and a father. It is my belief that now is the peak of my creative period, and I need full time to devote to sculpture. Not only would I use the time to create, but also to make extensive studies into animal and insect life." So he's struggling. He wants to have more time for his art. It's something that he's doing on the weekends and in the evenings while he works a full-time job. The Utica Observer-Dispatch reviewed his work, saying, "Henry DiSpirito, Utica sculptor, is an unusual combination of artist and craftsman. A stonemason by occupation, he has a technical skill acquired over many years of handling the tools of his trade, which combines with a genuine depth and power of artistic conception to produce an intensely personal and valid expression. Perhaps the outstanding feature of DiSpirito's work is the sense of genuine and honest respect for his material, a gift which he shares with such great sculptors as Michelangelo." Here on the left is an image of Proctor Park, which DiSpirito drew with pastel on paper, and that is another construction project that he worked on in the Utica area as a stonemason bricklayer. You can also see his mixed media work on paper of his working shoes. Again, another homage to the working man and that life that he led during the day. In the meantime, DiSpirito had made a home in Utica on the east side in the neighborhood where there was a heavy population of Italian and Syrian immigrants, as well as immigrants from all over Europe in particular. He met Rose Conti, and they married on June 11, 1927. They had 3 daughters, Dolores, Teresa, and Loretta, all of whom have been immensely helpful in my research as well, so I am grateful to have them around. They lived in a flat at 729 J Street, and then later at a house at 1008 Blandina Street in East Utica. You can see the view out his bedroom window. This work is really interesting because it combines DiSpirito's love of the natural world around him in the Mohawk Valley, but also the industry that supported his neighbors. And there was both a connection and a divide between him and his neighbors. As an artist, he felt somewhat removed from them, but as a stonemason and bricklayer, of course, there was that connection with the working man. So this was something that he dealt with throughout his life. I've talked a little bit about his sculptures, but the story of how DiSpirito gets into starting to create sculptures is, of course, really interesting. So when he was in Italy and studying art, he was studying painting only and 2-dimensional art, and that's what he did when he first arrived in the United States. In 1940, he was asked by his friend George Cook to join him on a WPA art project that he was working on under the direction of E.N. Clark. This WPA group had been commissioned to create a series of dioramas, 8 in total, using beeswax figures on wooden armatures to depict the history of the Mohawk Valley. And these were to be dedicated at the Oneida County Historical Society. Ultimately, they were dedicated in 1942. DiSpirito, of course, was invited to serve on this committee or to work on this working group, and he realized that he had the 2-dimensional art background, but not much experience with 3-dimensional artwork. So he started classes at the Munson-Williams-Proctor Art Institute, and that is where he studied under the sculptor Richard Davis. And Davis was the one who said to him, "You're a stonemason and bricklayer, why don't you try carving stone rather than additive sculpture using clay?" So that's something that he ultimately did. But one more note on the dioramas. I'm pleased to share that these, until very recently, were at the Children's Museum of Utica, but they have now gone to several different homes, and we have one here in the collection of the New York State Museum. Here are some of the carving tools that DiSpirito used as he began carving in stone and wood. He felt greatly influenced by Richard Davis. He was very grateful for him pushing him in the direction of stone carving, and he continued a relationship with him throughout his life, going back to him for advice. Davis wrote to him later in life, "Now about exhibiting, I would say this. If you can afford it, exhibit as much as possible. My reasons are that in showing your work and seeing your work in exhibitions with other sculpture, you will grow and improve and get valuable criticism." And that's definitely advice that DiSpirito took to heart. Here you can see, this is a really great example from our collection of the way in which DiSpirito would look at a piece of stone and find the hidden figure in it. So here you can see an elephant. You have the ears to the sides, and then the trunk that curls down around, and makes use of the natural curves of the stone and the shape that he was working with. And as I mentioned, he also carved in wood, especially later in life when it was difficult to carve in stone. And this is an example of a sunflower that's also in our collection. Another champion of DiSpirito's work, also from the Utica area, was Paul Coonrat. Coonrat had purchased a piece of Henry DiSpirito's work from the Munson-Williams-Proctor Art Institute in 1952, and he was so excited about it and so excited about DiSpirito's work that he offered himself as an agent, working free of charge. DiSpirito himself did not travel outside of the Mohawk Valley very often, and he didn't drive, but Paul Coonrat did. He, through his work, he was an author and an agent, and he was in New York City frequently. So he had access to art galleries and to different places that might be interested in DiSpirito's work. He wrote to DiSpirito, "I want you to know that I am proud to be your friend and equally proud to be a friend of your cobblestones, who are alive as you to me and a part of you. What little I am doing to introduce these friends to the world of art is not work. How could it be? Really, it is joyous and thrilling each time I present them, as I feel the warmth and immediate response that comes from their new friends." Coonrat was able to open a lot of doors to DiSpirito, and as I mentioned, he took Richard Davis's advice and exhibited. One of his breakout exhibitions was of this leaping frog at the Munson-Williams-Proctor Art Institute. He had first exhibited there while a student, and then his second show there was the 10th annual exhibition of work by artists of Utica and Central New York, which was a juried show. And the juror chose not only to exhibit this work, but also to purchase it for the permanent collection, and it is still in the collection there today. In 1950, at the 13th annual show, he was chosen as one of 3 artists deserving of a one-man show at the Munson-Williams-Proctor Art Institute, and that's his first documented one-man show. He would have numerous others at other institutions around Central New York. The Cooperstown Art Association was also a really important venue for DiSpirito to exhibit his work, to get it out there, get it seen, and also to be part of a community of artists. In 1947, the work you see here, The Snail, was accepted by the jury for its annual exhibition and awarded a first place in sculpture. And that really encouraged him. It made him feel that he was heading in the direction that he wanted to with his art. The Utica Observer-Dispatch noted that it was, quote, "typical of Henry DiSpirito's use of animal subjects to express an intense concern with the basic values of humanity." DiSpirito would continue his relationship with the Cooperstown Art Association, exhibiting in almost every annual exhibition between 1947 and 1985, and frequently winning awards there. Through the help of Paul Coonrat, he really got into New York City galleries as well, and those introductions that he had through Coonrat were invaluable. Coonrat would carry letters of introduction and photographs of DiSpirito's work to different galleries. In 1950 and 51, he had invitations to exhibit in 3 different institutions. After the battle, which we've seen before, and you can see on the bottom left, was requested in February 1950 for exhibition at the Sculpture Center in New York City. And that also was the beginning of a really important relationship for him. The Sculpture Center would maintain a collection of his works in the New York City area, sending them out to different galleries, having them available for people who wanted to purchase them. So that was an important way for him to have a presence in New York City without actually being there. Dorothea Denslow, who was the director of the Sculpture Center, encouraged him to apply for grants from the National Institute of Arts and Letters, which he received in 1956, and promoted his work tirelessly. In the upper right, you can see Lizard, which is now in the collection of the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. But this was sent to the Whitney in 1950 for their annual exhibition of contemporary American sculpture, watercolor, and drawings. At the Museum of Modern Art, he was invited to exhibit in 1951 in their New Talent exhibition alongside Irving Kreisberg and Raymond August Mintz. And he sent his works, The Ram, The Cannibal, Bee, Toad, Grasshopper, which you see on the upper left, and Squirrel. And he sold half of his works there. One of the bits of promotion that he got out there was the fact that his work was seen by the Rockefellers, and both David Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller purchased work from that exhibition and later purchased other work from him as well. And there was lots of correspondence back and forth between them over the years. Nelson actually wrote in 1957, "Your generous support of the arts is an asset to American culture. The tradition of the de Medici family is still carried on." The Ant, which you see here, was accepted to a show at the National Academy of Design in 1984 when he was 84 years old. The Sculpture Center had this piece on long-term exhibit and long-term hold for many years and agreed to deliver it for DiSpirito. So again, another example of the partnerships that he used to help him get out to exhibits in the New York City area. And of course, upstate New York was equally important. He exhibited at the Albany Institute, where he had a two-man show with his painter and friend Edward Christiana, also from the Utica area. He exhibited frequently at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, the Syracuse Museum of Fine Arts, the Robertson Memorial Gallery in Binghamton, and the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse. He had an exhibit at the Berkshire Art Association where he won an award by the jury and got to meet with Norman Rockwell, who was the juror. With all of these regional galleries, he also often participated in lending galleries. So many of these museums and galleries had selected works that you could lend out and borrow for your home so that you could live with fine art in your home. And this was really important to him. He had works in many of those. He also lent personally to people that wrote to him that they had seen his work in exhibitions and couldn't afford to purchase it, but wanted to have it in their home for a while. The sales of his works didn't make enough for him to quit working as a stonemason, so he continued to apply for grants in the 1950s. In 1954 and 57, he applied to the Guggenheim Fellowship Program, but he was unsuccessful. In 1956, he applied to the National Institute of Arts and Letters, where he was exhibited in a show of grant applicants' work and then a show of the artists who were chosen. So he was chosen for that one. And the thing that I find very funny in doing archives research on this is that Willem de Kooning and David Smith both applied that same year and were rejected. So good on DiSpirito for being accepted that year. This all brings us back to Utica, his adopted home. In his memoirs, he wrote, "It was in April 1921, after leaving my native land, Italy, that I arrived in Utica. And from then on, the city has been my home. The people, the industrial atmosphere, the scenic surroundings, and everything else pleased me greatly. The only things lacking for me were an art museum and an art school. In 1936, through the generosity of the Munson-Williams-Proctor Art Institute, a new cultural program began. It was a new life for the artists of the community, and I am proud to say that I have taken part in all the regional and local exhibitions. I'm presenting my 10th annual outdoor exhibition to the general public. I pay a modest tribute to my country of adoption and to my community. So DiSpirito had several working spaces in the Utica community. He would work in the basement of his Blandina Street home. He would work in the backyard at 729 J Street when he lived there. And he had a garage space that he worked in as well. And in all of those spaces, he frequently invited the public and the community to come see his work and to talk with him about what he was working on. And one of the ways he did that was through an annual outdoor exhibition of his work. He really valued these conversations, as he said, between sculptor and neighbor and sculptor and children. At J Street, he was just down the street from the John Brandicke Elementary School, and he frequently stopped children to ask them their ideas about what he was sculpting and what they thought his rocks looked like. He said that children don't lie, so he really valued their input. Later in his life, he did many programs for schools and lent works to exhibitions for children, which were hands-on. They were allowed to touch the sculptures, unlike in many museums today. This is in the garage studio, which he had on Jefferson Avenue. This allowed him to work year-round as opposed to being tied to his backyard on J Street, not weather dependent. The garage itself was acquired through Alfred Landolfini, who was also from a village near Castleforte in Italy, really showing the close connections within the Italian community of East Utica. And this photo is from one of those annual exhibitions that DiSpirito did. When the family moved to Blandina Street, the backyard really became the studio for exhibiting his work, studio space for exhibiting, and then he would also work in the basement during nights and during inclement weather. In the backyard garden, he used to display his sculptures on rocks and tree stumps, as you can see in the image here, and it became known as Henry's Garden. This was a place where friends, patrons, and museum gallery staff alike were all invited to come and visit and see his work and talk about it. DiSpirito, as I mentioned, rarely traveled to his exhibition openings in New York City or further afield in central New York, but visitors to the garden got a more complete experience, meeting the artist and often his family, viewing the sculptures in a more natural habitat, a place almost akin to where some of these animals would be on a regular basis. And it was really a calm oasis in an urban environment in East Utica. Then in 1963, DiSpirito got really the opportunity of a lifetime. He was awarded an artist in residency position at Utica College of Syracuse University by Dean Sturble, and that was renewed every year until his death in 1995. This allowed him a steady paycheck, so he was finally able to retire from working in stonemasonry and bricklaying, and it changed his whole working life, his whole outlook and persona. Edmund Wilson, in his novel Upstate, wrote, "We went to see Henry DiSpirito. I thought he was perceptibly changed. I think it has meant a lot to him to have his appointment and studio at Utica College so that he does not have to work at bricklaying anymore. He is having 2 exhibitions this summer and has won a prize at Cooperstown. He does not have to pretend to be humble. His face seems even more remarkable than his shock of snow-white hair, more expressive in its enthusiasm and humor. It is as if his stony physique had become with greater freedom more flexible. His wife says that he has lately had a great burst of work. After 60, he is prodigiously productive." The studio at the college was important for him also because it was separate from his home. It was a place to go and work and focus. And I think in these days, a lot of us working from home can really relate to that idea of getting separation between your home space and your workspace. It was also important as a place for him to talk to students and to have young people around and really invigorate him. He didn't have formal classes that he taught, but he was willing to work with students who were willing to work and to take advice. He developed many close relationships with both students and faculty. And of course, his works continue to dot the Utica College campus. You can see on the right here his work, The Pioneer, which was commissioned by Dean Sturble and Mr. F. Clark Laurie, the business manager of the college. The pioneer, of course, is the symbol of the school. To DiSpirito, he thought about the traditional visions of the pioneer, but he wanted to go beyond the idea of the American West. So he said, I tried to put him in a buckskin and coonskin cap, rifle in his hands, but I couldn't do it. I had no feeling for him that way. I saw the pioneer as a universal symbol, as well as the symbol of Utica College, and that's the way I had to make him. I told the late Dean Sturble, a man could be a pioneer in art, in culture, in knowledge, or as he was, a pioneer in education. I found a large fieldstone that was as rugged and as strong as I wanted my pioneer to be. I worked on it outside because when I finished it, that was where it would stand. I tried to keep it simple and make only suggestions of detail. And you can also see on the left-hand side the model that was created after a gentleman named Mack, which he used as the inspiration for his work of the pioneer. A really important piece to DiSpirito on the Utica College campus is the unfinished tiger. This was begun in 1971. He started carving, with permission from the administration, a boulder that was found during construction of buildings on campus. And as he continued to work on it, things flared in the world. The Black Panther movement began, and the administration started to worry about how this would be perceived. Even though he saw it as a tiger, it could be a panther, it could be a political statement, and they asked him to stop. He stopped immediately. He refused to comment on it for many years, and he was deeply saddened by the loss of this work. He would go to visit it in the off the beaten path place that it was stuck on campus. In 1986, he remarked that he wished that they would move it, and ultimately they did move it near the library, so it now has a place of pride on the campus. And just a couple more pieces. On the right is Dodging the Wind. This was his portrayal of students putting up with the weather and the wind to get to class and continue with their education. And on the right is Girl in the Wind, another piece inspired by this dance and movement of the wind that we see in life and that he was so often inspired by. Another community piece that DiSpirito worked on is the Volunteer Fireman. This is for the Deerfield Fire Company. They asked him, they wanted him to work on a commission to create a piece for in front of their firehouse. And he decided to work as a volunteer sculptor since they were volunteer firemen. So this was one of his contributions to the community, completed in 1970. And unlike his other works, this piece is made out of cast stone. It's not carved out of a single piece of stone, but instead constructed. I touched on very briefly the idea that DiSpirito was often reaching out to members of the community who were typically underserved by the visual arts. One of the ways that he did that was through numerous partnerships with organizations for the blind and having exhibits of his sculptures where they were allowed to actually touch work. So he worked with the Rehabilitation Center for the Blind in Topeka, Kansas. They approached him about buying a piece, and he, for free, sent out a rabbit sculpture with the stipulation that it be returned if it didn't meet their needs. But they found that it was greatly pleasing to the residents there, allowing them to wonder, and they said, to wonder about the man who can see inside of rocks. He also had shows in Pennsylvania as well as in central New York, specifically geared toward the visually impaired. And with these, not only were people who were visually impaired invited to come and touch the sculptures, but there were often education programs for the sighted so that they could wear a pair of glasses that helped them feel what it was like to be visually impaired and experience the world in that way. So it was a really important outreach in the community. And I'll close with a quote from Eugene Nasser, a friend of DiSpirito's and community member in Utica, who wrote about DiSpirito and other individuals in Utica who inspired the children of working class families. He said, Henry's example was the most telling of all, the immigrant stonemason with his toolbox, who, after a life of work much like that of our fathers, turned late in life to the call of his soul to art. And here you can see DiSpirito's studio chair and his jacket that he wore out to gather stones in nature. And one of his works, The Toad, again, a really great example of seeing how he freed the figure from inside the rocks. And I'll also close on the fact that if you're interested in learning more, there is a book published by the Fenimore Art Museum called Breathing Life into Stone, which includes not only history gleaned from the archives and from oral history interviews with his family, but also a transcription of his memoirs, many of which I quoted from today. But those are a really wonderful picture into his life as an immigrant and a sculptor in Utica.
And that last picture, was that his daughter's?
It was, yes.
I think the story of Henry DiSpirito is so inspiring to, you know, the working man, working people, but also to immigrants, which still make up a lot of our local community today.
Definitely.
And it's great that you're able to trace it back all the way to what his life was like in Italy beforehand. And you're still, you know, all of the work that you put in doing the research is still keeping his legacy alive. So I think that's very important, and very happy to have you here to tell his story today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. I know you mentioned a lot of places, Fenimore Art Museum, Munson-Williams-Proctor, where his art lives today. I'm just curious, is any of his art or works on display somewhere local that the public can see?
Well, certainly a lot of works are visible at Utica College, so the campus there is a great place to see his work. And I think they have a guide on their website, at least they used to, listing all of the works. But many of them are outside, some of them are in the library. There is a piece at the Utica Public Library, so that is available to see. Periodically, they do put out his works at the Munson-Williams-Proctor Art Institute. They're not out all the time, so do check ahead. But there are often works on view at the Fenimore Art Museum, and currently here at the New York State Museum, we have an exhibit of his work.
Wonderful. And it's great that you have the book, too, if people want to investigate more and learn more on their own. So.
Yes, it does have a list in the back of institutions that have his collection, so that's really helpful if you're looking for them.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, thank you again so much for joining us and presenting Henry DiSpirito's legacy. And thank you to everyone who watched this program. And if you have any questions, comments, you can put them in the comments of this video, or you can also send them directly to Ashley. So we'll provide you with her email address. And I'm sure she'd be happy to tell you more.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you everyone again for watching, and we will see you next time.